So we're thinking, maybe you're cool enough to hang out with us, Nikki said. Yeah. I was afraid to say much more. I didn't want to act too excited, but Nikki and his friends were awesome. They called themselves the Wolves because our school mascot was a mountain goat, and wolves could totally tear up any goat. They always took over the best basketball court at recess, and they had the coolest table at lunch. I couldn't believe they were actually giving me a chance to hang out with them.
Of course, there's a little test,
Nikki said. No problem. It didn't matter. I could handle anything.
Let's see.
Nikki turned toward the rest of the wolves, who stood in a half circle near us at the edge of the ball field.
Any ideas?
Climb the old bell tower, Stinky Miller suggested. Nikki shook his head.
Nah, we don't want to lose this one. He'll probably make a good wolf. Let's give him a break.
He paused for a moment, then snapped his fingers.
I know. All you have to do is spend the night in Brazelberg's.
You want me to spend the night in a store? Brazelberg's was an old department store downtown. 4 floors of stuff people used to buy before the mall came along. I heard it was closed to going out of business.
Yeah, just hide when they lock up and spend the night there. That's all. Can you handle it?
No problem. It almost seemed too easy. Nobody shopped there anymore, and the people who still worked there didn't really care what happened.
We'll need proof,
Nikki said. I thought for a second. I'm pretty smart, even if people don't treat me that way. So it was easy to think up something. Come to the front entrance a half hour before they open. I'll be standing there waving at you. Nikki grinned. Cool. See you then. He punched me in the shoulder, his way of saying goodbye, and walked off. I waited for him to go back inside, then rub the spot where he hit me. This was awesome. In less than a day, I'd be the newest member of the Wolves. I went home and made a couple of sandwiches to take with me. I couldn't find any plastic bags, so I wrapped the sandwiches in newspaper and put them in my jacket pocket. Nobody asked what I was up to or when I'd be back. That was no surprise. As long as I didn't blow up the place or burn it down, they didn't really care what I did. I walked to Brazelberg's about half hour before they closed. It was already growing dark by the time I got there. It wasn't that late, but a bunch of heavy clouds were coming in. I smiled at the thought of rain. It would be pretty funny if I was standing inside, all warm and dry, waving to a bunch of wet wolves getting soaked in the downpour. I'd have to be careful not to be too smug about it. Nobody paid attention to me when I walked inside the store. It was near closing time, so everybody was probably thinking about getting out of there and heading home. I took the elevator up to the furniture department. On the 3rd floor, I found a bed that was covered with a long quilt. Perfect. I made sure no one was watching, then dropped down and rolled under the bed. Just like that, I was in. As I waited for the store to close, I listened to the sound of people walking by and the rumble of thunder in the distance. Once, some little kid bounced on the bed. I thought about grabbing his ankle when he got off and giving him the scare of his life. It was almost too tempting to resist, but I managed to control myself. Still, it would have been funny to scare the little brat. After a long, dark wait, I heard them announce that the store was closing. A while later, I peeked out to check. Most of the lights were off, except for some dim nightlights. I was alone. I rolled out from underneath the bed. This was going to be no trouble at all. I looked around for something to do. Across the aisle on one side, I saw all kinds of pots and pans and other boring stuff. There was nothing except clothing on the other side. I sat and ate a sandwich, and then wandered over toward the clothes. There was one of those stupid mannequins near the aisle, wearing a fancy dress. "Pleased to meet you," I said. I reached out and shook her plaster hand. A crash of thunder startled me. For an instant, the lights flickered off. For an instant, I felt... No. It was too crazy. It couldn't have been. For that tiny fraction of a second, when the lights were out, the plaster hand I held seemed to become warm flesh. It was like when you put your hand on the ground and suddenly discover there's worms underneath it. I yanked my hand away. I reached to touch the mannequin again just to make sure it was only plaster, then changed my mind and backed off. No use spooking myself. The lights flickered again. I didn't like the idea that I could end up in the dark. I went over to the houseware section and snooped around. There was a package of candles. That would work. I searched a little more and found some lighters. I slipped one into my pocket and carried the candles back to the furniture department. I returned to the bed, but kept my eye on the dozen mannequins in the clothing department. I didn't want to be too close to them, but I also didn't want them to be out of my sight. The lights flickered again. They stayed off for a couple of heartbeats. That was enough. She moved. I couldn't say in what way, but she was different. They all were. I leaped off from the bed. Outside, the storm hit hard. Thunder shook the walls. The lights went out again. As the heartbeat stretched out far too long, I waited for the emergency lights to come on. They didn't. I grabbed the candles. The box was wrapped in plastic. I tried to tear it, but I couldn't get it open. I heard something moving across the aisle. I stumbled away, feeling ahead of myself in the dark. Footsteps shuffled behind me. It was dead black. The lighter! I grabbed it from my pocket and spun the wheel. The yellow and blue flame put a circle of light around me, a shield against the night. The mannequins were frozen, gathered, facing me. I saw a clear aisle to my right that led all the way to the stairs. The lighter was getting hot in my hand, but I knew exactly which way to run, and how far. I turned to race down the aisle for the stairs, letting the flame die. A dozen pair of footsteps followed me. I found the banister with my free hand and ran down the steps, turning at each landing. I kept going until I reached the bottom. I flicked the light on again for an instant. A large aisle ran straight from the bottom of the stairs. There had to be a door ahead. I spun down the aisle, keeping my hand out in front of me to feel for the door. I ran into the wall. The lighter fell from my fingers. I heard it bounce off the wall and slide across the linoleum. My hand, still pressed against the wall, told me what I didn't want to know. Instead of the glass of an exit door, I felt the rough, hard surface of painted cinder blocks. In my panic, I had run past the ground floor, all the way down to the basement. There were footsteps coming from the end of the aisle. Oh God, they followed me. I dropped to my knees and felt for the lighter. My fingers hit it. It slid, but I found it quickly. I flicked on the flame and looked behind me. The mannequins, at least a dozen of them, were halfway down the aisle from me. In the flickering light, they were nothing but lifeless plaster, bunched together like dead flowers forgotten in a vase. I searched for a way out. The lighter was growing hot again. Then I saw my escape. I ran down the aisle, toward a sales counter. They say I'm stupid. That's what they say in school. But a stupid kid wouldn't have figured out what to do. I reached the counter, then flicked on the lighter again to make sure. I jumped up on the counter. The ceilings were lower in the basement. I could reach the smoke detector. I wasn't stupid enough to think the lighter would set it off. I knew I needed smoke, but that was no problem. I pulled the second sandwich from my pocket, unwrapped it with the paper, and stood on my toes so I could hold the flaming paper close to the detector. In seconds, the alarm would be triggered. The firemen would come in and break through the door, shining flashlights in the dark store. I'd get in trouble. Big trouble. But that was fine. I wasn't afraid of trouble. A bell rang somewhere far off in the store. They must have a special power line for the alarms. I was smart enough to know that too. Alarms always had their own power. I could hold the mannequins off with a dim flame until I was rescued. I dropped the paper and stomped it out so I wouldn't get burned, but clutched the lighter in front of me with a shaking hand. The mannequins stood unmoving, unable to harm me in my circle of light. Then the rain fell. For an instant, as the water sprayed in my face from every direction, I had no idea why I was being soaked. I looked up, just as the lighter died with a hiss. Water shot from 1,000 sprinklers in the ceiling. I thumbed the wheel. The wet flint wouldn't spark. I kept trying. The footsteps came closer. I heard whispers, and then a laugh. Fingers wrapped my ankle. I was yanked from the counter. A dozen pair of hands grabbed my arms and legs.
Pleased to meet you too.
A soft voice whispered.
Join us.
A second voice said,
We have our own special club. We like you.
The wolves gathered outside the store a half hour before opening time. The rain had stopped. Nikki was there, looking in the door. They were talking and laughing. I was just off to the side by the window. I waved to them. Well, I actually couldn't call it a wave. One hand was raised. I can't move when the lights are on. Maybe it's just as well as they didn't notice me. I look kinda silly dressed in a jacket and tie, and I have this stupid smile stuck on my face. But that's alright. I'm with my new friends. I'll be with them forever. They really like me. Best of all, they know I'm not a dummy.